starting pitcher number 61. It's in the middle of an upside Flyers tier. This tier started with pitcher 56, Spencer Arrighetti, 57, Dustin May, 58, Gavin Williams, 59, Bubba Chandler, 60, Jackson Jobe. And we are going from prospects to veterans with number 61 here. It's Brandon Woodruff. And I gotta say, I have Woodruff 55. He's in a tier for me with Shohei Ohtani and Yu Darvish of like, I have some like injury question marks around these guys, but I think that they're probably really good. I think Brandon Woodruff has always been a really good pitcher. We've had the nerve issues in the past. We've had the surgery now, the shoulder capsule surgery. There are some questions, but he claims he is on track and ready to go for opening day. That's the last we heard out of his mouth. And I don't know if we're going to get 150 innings, but I think the innings we get are going to be good innings.
I was lowering him initially, but it does feel like Woodruff might start the season on the IL. It's possible, which is fine. The first week or two on the IL is totally cool with me. That means I get your innings later after I can already take more chances than other guys. I'm not as concerned in season about the innings workload ending abruptly, something like that. And look, this is the cliff where we're taking chances, making mistakes, getting messy, right? And why not take a chance on Brandon Woodruff? He doesn't even need to be as good as he used to be. He just needs to be solid. He needs, we want to see that 95 on that fastball with a good changeup, a slider for strikes. That's it. That's the package with Brandon Woodruff that has worked in the past. So I'm so curious to see what we get. I don't think that we're going to get a version of Woodruff that is just terrible. I think that
Right.
would surprise me a lot, but it might. I don't know yet. We don't have any data about what he's throwing out. He doesn't maybe even know what velocity he's at. And it might take us until even the start of May until we see Brandon Woodruff.
Right.
But again, don't treat that so negatively because you're drafting for a roster spot, not necessarily for a player. And that replacement value of that roster spot is still very valuable. So that's okay. I actually was talking to Ariel Cohen yesterday about maybe even making, and I haven't even mentioned this to Kyle Bland yet, making projections for certain guys as dollar value that includes the replacement level value dollar. So it's saying, hey, look, you get this production that we think for someone in the missing time that we think you're going to have because it's a straight swap as opposed to someone who's lower volume, but they don't go on the IL, right? So like for Spencer Strider, it's 1 month of the average starter on the waiver wire gets added to his strikeout total and
Okay.
his
I see what
win
you're saying.
total, right? That makes all the sense in the world to me because that's how I'm treating this. And I think guys like Woodruff, guys like even Yuri Perez or Sawyer Gibson Long, etc., would then be much more favorable in the eyes of many others. So something to think about there. But Brandon Woodruff, I think it's just too good of a opportunity to pass up on.
Agreed. I have this next guy ahead of Brandon Woodruff. And it's surprising because I had him just around this early in the offseason. But I have moved Kevin Gausman up to starting pitcher 42 for me. You have him
Whoa.
at 62. And I am admittedly maybe already adjusting for two Arsenal changes that we know Kevin Gossman is implementing. The first is obviously that he started throwing a sinker last year, and we assume will continue to use the sinker. And the second is the note that he is adding in a cutter this offseason. I have written about both in the Pitch Mix article that Nick and I have alluded to on previous episodes that published on Wednesday morning. So you could check that out over at NBC Sports, or if you read Nick's article over at Pitcher List, he has a link to my article within that article. So, and there's a link to Nick's article within my article. So, and also Lance Brosdowski wrote a piece, and Saris wrote a piece, and
Yeah.
they're all linked within the article. So check out that. It's our way of making sure we could cover as many new pitches as possible. But obviously, you and I have talked at length about how Gausman is kind of essentially a one pitch pitcher because the four seam fastball gets hit really hard and isn't
So hard.
particularly a good pitch. And so he has to rely on the splitter a lot. And so I love the idea for Gausman that he adds the sinker in for righties, the cutter in for lefties. He has two fastball variations to hitters of each handedness, which should keep them off the four seam fastball and should make the four seam fastball get hit less hard and potentially make the four seam fastball miss more bats if he starts to use it more in two strike counts. And then I also like the fact that theoretically both of those pitches can be used to jam hitters inside, right? The
Right.
cutter inside to lefties, the sinker inside to righties. You back the hitters off the plate, you have them looking and protecting inside, and then you're able to drop the splitter a little more effectively away. The keys here are that he couldn't command the sinker at all last year, so he needs to actually throw that pitch for strikes. And then the command of the splitter got worse last year, in particular against lefties. So that needs to improve as well. And so I guess I have already adjusted him based on assuming some of those changes, and maybe you haven't. But I'm curious if you see the cutter and the sinker like working relatively well in the spring, do you see yourself moving Gausman up a little bit?
So you just sent me down a whole thing. I'm like, huh. Yes, it was a 30% zone rate on the sinker against right-handers last year.
Yeah,
Kind
it's
of by
not good.
design. He also had an 87th percentile O swing, right? So it
And
was
he
like a
and he
50.
used it low like all the time.
It
He
was
did not
always
jam
in
hitters inside,
always inside.
up and in. Yeah.
Like, the eye lock, which is inside locations, 84% against right-handers. I mean, insane. And then as you mentioned, low lock, yes, 68% at 97th percentile, right?
Mhm.
So he was really working with that a ton, which I mean, I think that's good enough. I know the strike rate is not good, but he gets enough strikes with everything else. Like, this should be a surprise pitch. This should be something that's different. At least just that sets up at least the four seamer better, because
Yeah.
now it does make them aware of that, and then the four seamer can't be as effective. But he only threw it 10% of the time. I mean, over the full season, got increased a bit more, of course, by the end when he actually really introduced it. Um, I don't know if it's enough for me to really get in on Gausman. And the cutter, I hope it's good. I do want to be clear. I know I'm so in on cutters. Not all cutters are great,
Yes.
and Gosman's feel for spin is terrible. So it might not be that good of a pitch, and also might not be one that he can command well. We don't know
Mhm.
yet. It does make sense because it would certainly help against left-handers, and especially with that splitter being so bad for Gausman last year. 52% strike rate, 14% swing strike rate. This is supposed to be like the best pitch ever against left-handers. This used to be a over 60% strike rate and a 20%, maybe 25% swing strike rate to them. So that has to come back. We saw it come back alive at the end of last year, fine, but that still isn't a guarantee for me. And I think the real problem I have with Gausman is I talked about with all of these guys is like, hey, we can make quick decisions. I
And
don't
you can't.
think that we'll
Yeah.
get enough information to be able to make a quick decision on Kevin Gausman.
I buy that.
And by the end of the year last year, he had 3.82 ERA and a 122 whip. And imagine anyone that drafted Gausman held on to him for the entire year.
And
You
if you didn't get lucky with those wins, those 14 wins, it would have been a
right.
far worse season for you.
Absolutely, and that 1-2-2 whip, that hurt in your 12-teamer.
Mhm.
3-8-2, that hurt in your 12-teamer. I know it sounds crazy, but if you're in a roto league, that's a ton of innings of an ERA that you're trying to beat to actually get closer to 10, 11, 12 points in your roto leagues, right?
Right.
And so it's tough. I'm in this really torn scenario where I do see the path for Gausman being better, but also I can get trapped, and I don't wanna
Yeah.
get trapped. So I kinda wanna put him as a hipster. I moved him out of the hipster tier for that hope that the sinker is helpful enough and he found the splitter, but, I might find myself lowering him again, down
Yeah.
closer to the 70s. Sorry,
I
Gosman.
did I did note in the article that I again is over on NBC Sports that we have this idea that like Kevin Gausman has always been this like elite starting pitcher. The reality is he's been in the big leagues for 11 full seasons. I'm not including 2020, which was not a full
Sure.
season, but he has been in baseball in the big leagues for 11 full seasons, and only in 3 of them has he really had elite seasons.
Wow.
They were the 2 years in San Francisco, the 2 full years in San Francisco. Again, he was good in the shortened 2020 season. It was only 10 starts, so we don't want to read too much into that. But the first 2 years in San Francisco, sorry, the 2021 in San Francisco and the first 2 years in Toronto are really the only time that he was like really good. He had 1 year in Baltimore where he had a 3.61 ERA, which
Oh, I
was,
remember
you
that
know,
way back
obviously
when. It was like
which
a
was
120 whip
solid,
or something,
but
or
that was a 123 whip and a
yeah.
22% strikeout rate, which is like, eh.
I mean, I
Like
mean,
that was
right. I
maybe
remember we were getting excited about it, and that was like
yeah,
his second season or something like that.
yeah.
And we're like, oh, and then oh,
So there's not this track record of Gausman being like, oh, he's been elite for a decade and he just
yeah,
lost it
right,
last
right,
year.
right.
It's a guy who was promise, but he didn't really have results. Then he put it together for a short period of time, and
Yeah,
now maybe he didn't, and that's kind of the nature of guys that rely on splitters.
absolutely.
And maybe the story of the next guy too, who's Lucas Giolito, who also is somebody who was filled with promise, seemed to put it together, then seemed to lose it, and we're hoping he puts it together again. It's hard to really analyze Giolito because he threw no pitches last year and was moving to a new team last year. So we have what we thought he was going to be doing in Boston because it was what he was showing in the spring, but we don't have any major league innings to suggest that he did it. So we not only have is he getting healthier, but also what really is he going to do in Boston, which we still don't have the answer to. His interviews from last offseason suggested that Boston, when they signed him, basically was like, hey, your slider has become too curveballish, and that's why it's getting hit really hard. And we want to make it more the slider you had been throwing in your really good years.
Yeah,
And then the fastball velocity was up and the location was better, and there was some more IVB, and then he blew out his arm. With Cutter Crawford being sidelined with a knee injury and Brian Bayo delayed, like Giolito was going to be in this rotation at the
oh
start of the
yeah,
season.
oh
And
absolutely.
we don't know if they'll toy with his innings later, but he's going to start the year in the rotation. He's been a really good pitcher for a few years. The Red Sox seem to suggest they have a plan to get some of that back. And so I love taking this chance here because, again, to your point, you probably will know early on, like, is this the Giolito of 2023 or is it the Giolito of 2021? And you'll be able to look at the pitch shape and you'll be able to look at the velocity and you'll be able to make a call after a start or two whether he's worth holding on to or not.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. Yeah, Giolito, I think, is going to be a workhorse for the Red Sox, and maybe, and he said he wanted to go 30 starts, of course, of 33 innings each. So that it can keep underneath 130, right?
Yeah,
Right, 4 innings each,
obviously.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
But
cool.
no, it's I think it's pretty clear that Giolito is one of the better ceiling plays you can make, and like you said, we'll know pretty early if it's any different or if it's kind of the old Giolito. So I'm a huge fan of it.
So after all of our discussion early on in my initial starting pitcher ranks, you have Walker Bueller 64th. I have Walker Bueller 61st. We've kind of come to the same area where I am ready to move him up in spring. I need to see a couple things. Um, I'm ready to move him up in spring. I have a note in my top 150 starting pitchers that, like, I crafted an off the field narrative for Chris Sale last year in my head. I've crafted it for Walker Bueller in my head. I don't know that, like, his thoughts that with his comments that pitching in the World Series like kind of snapped things back into focus for him and kind of like lit a fire under his butt a little bit is like how
Mhm.
he referred to it. And I think there's a little bit of that mixed with signing a 1 year prove it deal of wanting to go out and show that he is still a top level pitcher so that he can make big money on his probably final long-term contract. And I do believe that stuff matters. And then you pair that with the Red Sox maybe having a pitching philosophy that will help to mitigate some of the diminishing returns on his four seam fastball. And I see the glimmer of hope there. But I also need to see if his approach is going to be different in the spring. If he's still just throwing the same four seamer, there's no more sweeper, there's no cutter, there's no, we're not changing anything. I don't know that I can move him up at all.
I mean, Bueller to me is someone who's still trying to figure out how to be a good pitcher without his 18 to 20-inch vert four seamer from 2021. That's really the whole deal in my view. And even in 2022, he didn't quite have it. He wasn't as effective, but it was Tommy John, so fine. I remember actually doing a video on Walker Bueller that year, and I think it was this complete game against the Diamondbacks, and I watched all of it, and I was like, I'm not impressed. Everyone goes, "You're ridiculous. It's Walker Bueller." And then he gets Tommy John. And it wasn't really that great after it because Walker Bueller is someone that needs his fastball to establish everything.
Mm-hmm.
And he's never really been this, oh, look at these filthy secondaries destroying everything. They've
Right.
been more strike pitches. And it's always been weird because I feel like they should be really good, but they're not. So I'm still waiting for Walker Buehler to showcase something that really wows me. And his biggest asset has been location over the years. After that four seamer, not, even with the four seamer being so good, he could still manipulate the zone perfectly
Mhm.
with the secondaries underneath and along the edges and all this stuff. That was the extra element to it. We didn't really see that last year. And we saw a guy who was just lost when he hit the mound. My understanding is, at least from out here, is that Walker Buehler tried to do the things of old, while I would think that the Dodgers were like, "Yo, please change this." And they're like, "Nah, I got this." And he's
Yeah.
like, "Oh, this isn't very good." And finally started to listen. And of course, the playoffs are the playoffs, and say whatever you want about that. I generally don't like leaning too heavily because there are a lot of things going on with the playoffs, and they
Sure.
change players and bring out something that we don't see for the regular season for many reasons. That said, I like to think that he's in the process of building it back up. And Walker Buehler and the Red Sox, I think that's a good fit for him. They're gonna need him to go
Mhm.
90, 100 pitches per game. It's a 1-year deal, so they don't need to be protective of him. It all makes sense. I just hope that there's enough quality here for me to feel like this is actually a Holly and not a Toby. And I'm not sure yet. I don't know if I'm really gonna see it super early in the year that I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool. He's amazing and he's great." But I hope we do. And I feel like I'm willing to take a chance on Bueller figuring it out across the first month. So I go back and forth on like Giolito and Bueller a ton. And I think Giolito's track record speaks a little bit better, even though the last two seasons that we've seen of him in full have not been strong. I think that generally the foundation of Giolito is a little stronger than Bueller's, but I'm very curious what we get. And honestly, I'd love to have both of them on my team.
Yeah, and this is the area where you take those chances and you see kind of like what pans out early on in the year, and I fully get that. We have another pitcher coming off injury who wraps up this episode. It's Jesus Luzardo, and Jesus Luzardo is somebody where like I'm fairly comfortable throwing out 2024. There were just multiple injuries that he was pitching through for the vast majority of the season, and then missed like the entire second half of the season. So you've got a pitcher who pitched most of the year either battling injury or was not on the mound at all, moving to a brand new team. And so there's a lot of just like moving parts, elements. The team context certainly gets better for Jesus Luzardo. The ballpark certainly gets worse for Jesus Luzardo. So there's a little bit of like mix and match in that. And then he's another guy who, is pitching for a contract.
Yeah.
He I believe he's arbitration eligible next year. I'd have to take a look while you're talking, but like he is he could he could have a new team. He could be a free agent. He needs to kind of like reestablish a little bit of that value that he lost with some struggles and with injuries. And so I
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of motivation there. Yes, he's arbitration eligible for one more year, and then will be a free agent.
So there's oh man. So Luzardo's someone that I just have not wanted to draft because he's so frustrating. And it finally is at a point of, okay, cool. We have clear flaws that can be fixed. And it doesn't cost me a top 200 to 25 draft pick.
Right.
The ceiling here is a guy that has two whiff pitches and 25% strikeout ability on a winning ball club who's going to let him go every 5 days and pitch 6 innings. Right?
Mhm.
That's ooh, okay. All right, you got me there. What are the flaws? Well, his four seamer comes with second percentile extension. So this is when he's throwing 96 or so, 97. That actually makes it look like 95, which is good. But when he's throwing 95, it makes it look like 93. And that you really should have that in your head. That explains a little bit of that lack of whiff rate. Also, it's not a vert pitch. It's actually a horizontal movement pitch, kind of like a sinker. Not as extreme as a sinker, but it has that, right? So he's using it wrong, in my view. What he's doing against right-handers right now is he's going upstairs, which is fine, but he's trying to go inside with it. And last year, Luzardo threw too many of these that leaked over the plate, and this pitch got destroyed by right-handers
Right.
constantly. And in two strike counts as well, you have the slider that he does throw predominantly in that, and those would also have mistakes to right-handers over the plate. So two quick fixes here. One, you've got that slider. Please, hey, just limit that a little bit. You have an elite changeup for right-handers. Just kind of throw that a little bit more. And then you have the four seamer that is being used away to
Mhm.
left-handers. And this is trying to be like a backdoor thing, fine, but you could jam guys so easily with this. This is a horizontal one. This is would surprise so many guys, get all these weak outs, and it might be a little bit better when you're not throwing a slider for like a 53% strike rate to lefties. This is supposed to be like the best pitch against lefties, and you didn't execute that. So those are three flaws, right? The
Sure.
slider location to right-handers at two strike counts, which is cured by the changeup being utilized a bit more and being a little more careful, like almost like Snell with that slider to right-handers. You move the four seamer to inside against left-handers, and then you nail down the slider against left-handers, please, for the love of gosh. Okay, let's just get that out there. So that's very attainable. I also think that pitching for the Phillies, like you talk about mindset, that's got to be exciting for him.
Sure.
You know,
It's the first
and,
time he's been on a legitimately
right?
competitive team.
And that's going to be a new environment for him. It's not all in his shoulders. He's got Nola and Wheeler there. I mean, this to me is the perfect setup for Luzardo to flourish. And then I also remember, oh yeah, but that fastball does get hit really, really hard. Oh yeah, he does make a lot of mistakes in that slider. And it can be the most frustrating pitcher to roster.
Mhm.
So I really wrestled with this. I initially had like Luzardo like in the 70s or so. I was like, I just don't want to deal with it. And then I discover all these little flaws that I think the Phillies in their development will catch and be able to, let's change this a little bit.
Mhm.
And I was really tempted to put him like in my 40s or something because of
Yeah.
this.
I get that.
But I kind of settle at this of like it can go either way. And I might be even raising him closer to about 55 or something like that, right around Dustin May, because there is such clear potential of going like 6 innings, 8 Ks, one walk or something, one earned run, like constantly. And I'm very tempted to go after that in my drafts.